I never imagined that putting up Christmas lights in February would land me in a 7-month battle with my homeowners association. But here I am, sitting in my living room in Chandler, Arizona, staring at a check for $700 and a formal apology letter that I honestly never thought I would receive. Let me back up to explain how this entire mess started, because looking back now, it seems almost ridiculous that something so simple could spiral into such a complicated situation that involved lawyers, board meetings, and eventually exposed a pattern of behavior that nobody in our neighborhood had fully understood until everything came to light. My name is David Martinez, and I am a 34-year-old software engineer who bought my first house about 2 years ago in a planned community called Sunset Ridge Estates. The neighborhood is one of those cookie-cutter developments that popped up during the housing boom, with stucco houses painted in various shades of beige and tan, perfectly manicured lawns that the HOA obsesses over, and rules about everything from mailbox colors to the types of plants you can have in your front yard. When I bought the place, I knew there was an HOA, but the real estate agent assured me it was relatively reasonable compared to some others in the Phoenix metro area. For the first year and a half, I kept my head down and followed all the rules without much thought. I mowed my lawn on schedule, kept my garbage cans hidden from street view except on collection days, and generally tried to be the kind of neighbor who did not cause any problems. I worked from home most days, which meant I had plenty of time to maintain the property and stay on top of things. My neighbors were friendly enough, though most people kept to themselves in that typical suburban way where you wave when you see each other, but do not really know much about each other's lives. The holiday season rolled around in December, and I decided to put up some Christmas lights. Nothing crazy or over the top, just some tasteful white LED lights along the roofline and a lit wreath on the front door. I had seen plenty of other houses in the neighborhood with similar decorations, some even more elaborate than mine, so I figured I was well within whatever guidelines existed. The lights looked nice, and I got a few compliments from neighbors who walked their dogs past my house in the evenings. January came and went, and honestly, I just forgot about the lights. I was deep into a major project at work, pulling long hours even though I was working from home, and taking down decorations was not high on my priority list. Plus, I actually liked how the white lights looked. They were not screaming Christmas anymore, just providing a nice ambient glow in the evening. I had this vague thought that I would take them down eventually, maybe when the weather warmed up a bit more, but it was not something I was actively thinking about. February 14th arrived, Valentine's Day, and I came home from a rare trip to the office to find a letter tucked into my front door. The envelope had the Sunset Ridge Estates HOA logo printed on it, which immediately made my stomach sink a little. I had heard stories from coworkers about HOA drama, but I had managed to avoid any issues up until that point. I opened the envelope right there on my front porch, and what I read made my blood pressure spike immediately. The letter was formal and cold, written in that particular bureaucratic language that HOAs seem to love. It stated that I was in violation of community standards for having holiday decorations displayed outside the appropriate season. The fine was listed as $100, due within 30 days. But here is where it got interesting. The letter referenced Section 7.3 of the HOA Covenants, Conditions, and Restrictions, which apparently dealt with seasonal decorations. However, the letter did not actually quote the rule or explain what the time limit was supposed to be. It just said I was in violation and demanded payment. I went inside and immediately pulled up the HOA documents that I had received when I bought the house. They were in a PDF that was about 70 pages long, filled with dense legal language that I had only skimmed when I first moved in. I searched for Section 7.3 and found the relevant passage. I read it once, then twice, then a third time because I could not believe what I was seeing. The rule stated that holiday decorations should be displayed in a manner consistent with the spirit and timing of the holiday being celebrated. That was it. There was no specific date range. There was no mention of how many days after a holiday the decorations had to come down. It was completely vague and open to interpretation. I felt a mix of anger and vindication. They were fining me for violating a rule that did not actually exist in any specific form. I sat down at my computer and drafted a response letter that same evening. I kept it professional but firm, pointing out that Section 7.3 contained no specific time limit for holiday decorations, and therefore I could not be in violation of a standard that was not clearly defined. I stated that I would not be paying the fine and requested that it be removed from my account. I printed the letter, put it in an envelope, and dropped it off at the HOA management office the next morning before work. I thought that would be the end of it. I genuinely believed that once they realized their mistake, they would back down and we could all move on with our lives. I was so incredibly wrong about that assumption, and I had no idea what I was about to walk into. A week passed without any response, which I took as a good sign. Maybe they had reviewed the documents, realized I was right, and quietly dropped the matter. I finally took down the Christmas lights that weekend, more because I was thinking about it than because I felt pressured to do so. The wreath came down too, and I boxed everything up and stored it in the garage. I felt like I had stood up for myself in a reasonable way and avoided an unfair fine. Then, on February 23rd, I got another letter. This one was even more formal than the first, and it made my hands shake as I read it. Not only were they upholding the original $100 fine, but they were adding a $50 late fee for failure to pay within the first week, plus another $50 fine for what they called continued defiance of board directives. The total was now $200, and they were threatening to place a lien on my property if I did not pay within 14 days. I could not believe what I was reading. I had taken down the decorations. I had responded with a legitimate argument based on their own documents. And now they were threatening a lien on my house, which could affect my ability to sell or refinance, over something that was not even clearly defined as a violation. This was insane, and I knew I needed to escalate my response. I spent that entire weekend researching HOA law in Arizona. I learned that homeowners associations have a lot of power, but they also have to follow their own rules and state regulations. I discovered that Arizona Revised Statutes Title 33, Chapter 9 covers planned communities and HOAs, and there are specific requirements for how they have to operate. I also found out that if an HOA rule is vague or ambiguous, courts generally interpret it in favor of the homeowner, not the association. Armed with this information, I drafted a much more detailed letter. I cited the specific statute about rule enforcement, pointed out again that Section 7.3 contained no specific time limits, and explained that I had already removed the decorations anyway. I also noted that the escalating fines seemed punitive rather than corrective, especially since the supposed violation no longer existed. I sent this letter via certified mail so I would have proof of delivery, and I kept copies of everything for my records. March rolled around and I heard nothing. The 14-day deadline they had given me passed without any follow-up communication. I started to relax a little, thinking maybe my second letter had finally gotten through to someone with common sense. I focused on work, enjoyed the beautiful Arizona spring weather, and tried to put the whole stupid situation out of my mind. Then, on March 19th, I came home to find a notice posted on my front door. This was not a letter in an envelope. This was a bright yellow piece of paper that said "Violation Notice" across the top in bold red letters, visible to anyone who walked past my house. I ripped it down immediately, my face burning with embarrassment and anger. The notice said that I had failed to pay outstanding fines, and that the HOA board was proceeding with placing a lien on my property. It also said, I was now barred from using any common area amenities until the matter was resolved. That was the moment I decided I was done trying to handle this myself. I needed legal help because this had gone way beyond a simple disagreement about Christmas lights. This was affecting my property rights and my reputation in the neighborhood. I could see Mrs. Patterson from across the street watching from her window as I tore down the yellow notice, and I knew it would be all over the neighborhood gossip chain within hours. I called a real estate attorney named Jennifer Blake, who had been recommended by a coworker who had dealt with his own HOA issues a few years back. Her office was in Scottsdale, and I was able to get an appointment for the following afternoon. I brought all my documentation with me. The original fine letter, my responses, the escalating fines, the yellow notice, and a printed copy of the HOA covenants with Section 7.3 highlighted. Jennifer was in her mid-40s, sharply dressed, and had the kind of no-nonsense demeanor that immediately made me feel like I was in good hands. She reviewed everything I brought while I sat in her office, occasionally making notes on a legal pad. When she finished reading, she looked up at me with an expression that was half amused and half irritated. "This is one of the most poorly written HOA rules I have seen in a while," she said, tapping the page with Section 7.3. "There is absolutely no way they can enforce a specific time limit when none is stated in the covenant, and the way they have escalated these fines is aggressive even by HOA standards. Have you had any other issues with this board before?" I shook my head. "This is my first problem with them. I have been a model homeowner as far as I know. I follow all the rules, pay my dues on time, keep my property maintained. I do not understand why they are coming after me so hard over something so trivial." Jennifer leaned back in her chair. "Sometimes HOA boards get a little drunk on power, especially if they have been operating without much pushback from homeowners. They start to think they can do whatever they want. Other times there is a personal element involved. Do you know anyone on the board?" "Have you had any conflicts with any of your neighbors?" I thought about it carefully. "I do not really know any of my neighbors that well. I am friendly with everyone, but I keep to myself mostly. I have no idea who is on the board actually. I have never been to a meeting or paid much attention to that side of things." She nodded. "Okay, here is what I recommend. I am going to draft a formal legal response to the HOA on your behalf. I will cite the relevant statutes and make it very clear that they do not have grounds for these fines. I will also demand that they remove the lien threat and restore your access to common areas. If they do not respond appropriately, we can file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate, which oversees HOAs, and potentially take them to small claims court for harassment." "How much is this going to cost me?" I asked, because I knew attorneys were not cheap and this was already costing me money in theoretical fines. "My initial letter and review will be $500. If we have to go further, we will discuss additional fees." But honestly, most HOAs back down pretty quickly once a lawyer gets involved, especially when they know they are on shaky ground. I would be surprised if this goes beyond the initial letter. I agreed to her terms and wrote a check on the spot. It felt good to have someone in my corner who actually knew what they were doing. Jennifer told me she would have the letter drafted and sent out within 2 business days, and she would copy me on everything. I left her office feeling more confident than I had in weeks. True to her word, Jennifer sent me a copy of her letter on March 21st. It was 3 pages of carefully worded legal language that made my own attempts at formal communication look like a child's homework assignment. She systematically dismantled every aspect of the HOA's case, cited multiple Arizona statutes, and gave them 10 business days to respond with a full withdrawal of all fines and threats. The tone was professional but unmistakably firm, and I could only imagine how it would be received by whoever was running the HOA board. The response came faster than I expected. Only 5 days later, on March 26th, I received a certified letter from the HOA. My hands were actually shaking as I opened it, and I felt a rush of relief when I read the first paragraph. They were withdrawing the fines, all of them. The letter said that upon further review, the board had determined that Section 7.3 was ambiguous and required clarification before it could be enforced. They were removing all charges from my account and lifting the threat of a lien. However, and this was the part that irritated me, they did not apologize. The letter was cold and procedural, making it sound like they were doing me a favor rather than admitting they had been wrong from the start. I called Jennifer immediately to tell her the news. She sounded satisfied but not surprised. That is what I expected would happen. They knew they had no case once a lawyer pointed out the obvious problems. Are you happy with this resolution, or do you want to push for something more? I thought about it. The fines were gone, which was my main goal. But I was still angry about the way I had been treated, the public shaming with the yellow notice, and the stress they had put me through over something so stupid. What else could I push for? I asked. You could demand a formal apology. You could ask for compensation for the attorney fees you incurred as a result of their improper actions. You could request that they revise Section 7.3 to include specific timelines so this does not happen to other homeowners. It depends on how much energy you want to put into this. I made a decision in that moment that I would not have expected from myself a few months earlier. I want all of that. I want them to make this right, not just make it go away. Other people in this neighborhood should not have to go through what I just went through. Jennifer agreed to draft another letter with those demands. She sent it out on April 1st, which felt oddly appropriate given how ridiculous this entire situation had become. This letter was even more pointed than the first, noting that the HOA's actions had been not just mistaken but potentially harassing, and that I had incurred unnecessary legal expenses due to their refusal to acknowledge a clear ambiguity in their own rules. This time, the response took longer. April passed with no word from the HOA. I started to wonder if they were just going to ignore the request, figuring that they had already given me what I originally wanted. Jennifer told me to be patient, that these things often moved slowly, especially when boards had to meet and discuss things collectively rather than having one person make decisions. In the meantime, I started paying more attention to HOA matters in my neighborhood. I looked up when the board meetings were held and who was on the board. It turned out the president was a woman named Karen Whitmore, which almost made me laugh because of course her name was Karen. She lived 4 streets over from me in one of the larger houses in the development. The vice president was a man named Robert Chen, and there were 3 other board members whose names I recognized but did not know personally. I decided to attend the next HOA meeting, which was scheduled for April 15th. I had never been to one before, and I was curious to see how they operated and whether my situation would come up at all. The meetings were held in the community clubhouse, a bland building near the neighborhood pool that mostly sat empty except for the occasional birthday party rental. I arrived at 7 in the evening, the scheduled start time, and was surprised to find only about a dozen other people there. For a neighborhood of 200 homes, that seemed like a pretty poor turnout. The board members sat at a long table at the front of the room, and Karen Whitmore was immediately recognizable. She was probably in her early 50s, with short blonde hair styled in that particular way that seemed designed to communicate authority, and she wore a blazer even though it was 70 degrees outside. She had the look of someone who took her position very seriously, perhaps too seriously. The meeting started with standard procedural stuff: approval of the previous meeting's minutes, a financial report, discussion of upcoming landscaping for common areas. It was all incredibly boring, and I found my mind wandering. But then, about 40 minutes in, Karen brought up what she called enforcement matters. "We have had several compliance issues this quarter," she said, looking down at a paper in front of her. "I want to remind everyone that the board takes covenant enforcement very seriously." We have had to issue fines for various violations including unauthorized paint colors, improper garbage can storage, and inappropriate seasonal decorations. My ears perked up at that last one, and I felt my face get hot. She was talking about me, even though she was not using names. I raised my hand and Karen looked at me with an expression that I could not quite read. "Yes, do you have a question?" she asked. I stood up, my heart pounding. "I am David Martinez, and I believe I am one of the cases you are referring to regarding seasonal decorations. I was fined for having Christmas lights up in February, but when I reviewed the covenants, I found that there is no specific time limit stated in Section 7.3. After getting an attorney involved, the board dropped all the fines. I am wondering why the board was enforcing a standard that does not actually exist in the written rules." The room got very quiet. I could see the other board members exchanging glances, and Karen's expression hardened. "The board interprets the covenants based on community standards and reasonable expectations," she said stiffly. "While the specific language may not include exact dates, it is understood that Christmas decorations should come down in a timely manner after the holiday." Understood by whom? I asked, staying calm but firm. If it is not written in the covenants, how is a homeowner supposed to know what the expectation is? And how can you fine someone for violating a rule that is not clearly stated? Robert Chen, the vice president, leaned forward. "Mr. Martinez, this matter has already been resolved. The fines were withdrawn. I do not think this is the appropriate forum to rehash it." "Actually, I think this is exactly the appropriate forum," I countered. "These are board meetings where homeowners are supposed to be able to discuss HOA business. And this is HOA business that affects everyone in this room. If the board can fine me for something that is not clearly written in the rules, they can do it to anyone. I think the rule needs to be revised to include specific timelines so there is no ambiguity." A few other homeowners murmured in agreement, which surprised me. Karen looked distinctly unhappy now. "We will take your suggestion under advisement," she said in a tone that suggested she would do no such thing. "Now, if we can move on to the next item on the agenda." I sat down, my adrenaline pumping. I had not planned to confront them publicly like that, but once I started talking, it felt important to say what needed to be said. After the meeting ended, several other homeowners came up to me. A man named Thomas, who lived 2 streets over, told me he had been fined $50 for leaving his garbage cans visible from the street for more than 12 hours on collection day, even though he had been at work and could not get home in time. A woman named Patricia said she had been threatened with fines for having roses in her front yard that were supposedly the wrong shade of red according to the approved plant list. As I listened to these stories, I started to realize that my situation was not unique. The board, or more specifically Karen Whitmore, had been enforcing rules in an arbitrary and often unreasonable way. People had been paying fines and compliance fees without questioning them because they did not know they could push back. I felt angry on behalf of all these homeowners who had been bullied by their own HOA. Over the next few days, I could not stop thinking about what I had learned at that meeting. I did some more research into HOA law and homeowner rights. I found out that in Arizona, homeowners have the right to review all HOA financial records and board meeting minutes. I submitted a formal request to inspect these documents, citing Arizona Revised Statutes Section 33-1805. The HOA management company, which handled the administrative side of things for our board, responded within the required 10 days and gave me access to 2 years' worth of financial records and meeting minutes. I spent an entire Saturday going through everything, and what I found was disturbing. In the past 2 years, the HOA had collected over $30,000 in fines and compliance fees from homeowners. This was separate from the regular dues that everyone paid. Some homeowners had been fined multiple times for minor violations or for the same violation repeatedly. There was one case where a homeowner had been fined every month for 6 months for having a crack in their driveway, even though the meeting minutes showed they had submitted multiple quotes for repair and were waiting for scheduling with a contractor. Even more concerning, the financial records showed that Karen Whitmore's own company, a property management consulting firm, had been paid over $8,000 in advisory fees over the past year. This seemed like a potential conflict of interest, and I was not sure it had been properly disclosed to the homeowners. I compiled all of this information into a detailed report and sent it to Jennifer Blake. She reviewed it and confirmed that there were several red flags. "At minimum, this is poor governance," she told me over the phone. "At worst, it could be considered self-dealing or embezzlement if those advisory fees were not properly authorized and disclosed. You should file a complaint with the Arizona Department of Real Estate." I filed the complaint on May 2nd. The ADRE took these matters seriously because rogue HOA boards had been a problem in Arizona for years, leading to new regulations and oversight. I provided all my documentation and included statements from other homeowners who had agreed to go on record about their own fine experiences. Things moved slowly after that, which was frustrating. I kept going to HOA board meetings, now joined by Thomas, Patricia, and a few other homeowners who were fed up with the board's behavior. We started asking pointed questions about finances, rule enforcement, and decision-making processes. Karen Whitmore became increasingly hostile, cutting off questions and rushing through agendas. The tension in these meetings was palpable. In early June, I got a letter from the HOA's attorney, not the management company but an actual law firm. My stomach dropped when I saw it, thinking they were going to sue me for something. But when I read it, I was stunned. The letter informed me that the HOA board was offering to reimburse me for my attorney fees as a gesture of good faith and in recognition that the initial fine had been improperly assessed. They were offering $500, which was exactly what I had paid Jennifer for her initial work. But the letter also included something I had not expected, a formal apology. It was brief and somewhat stiff, but it was there. The board acknowledged that Section 7.3 was ambiguous and that I should not have been fined without a clear violation of a specific rule. They apologized for the stress and inconvenience caused and stated that they were in the process of reviewing and clarifying all covenant language to prevent similar situations in the future. I called Jennifer immediately. "This is good," she said. "They are trying to settle things before the ADRE investigation gets too far along. Take the money and the apology, but keep watching what happens with the investigation because that is about bigger issues than just your fine." I accepted the offer and a check for $500 arrived within a week. It felt like a victory, even if it was a small one. I had stood up to the HOA and won, but I knew the larger battle was still ongoing. The ADRE investigation took months, which I was told was normal for these types of cases. In the meantime, there was a shift happening in the neighborhood. More homeowners started attending board meetings. People were talking to each other about their experiences with fines and rule enforcement. There was a growing sense that change needed to happen. In August, the HOA held elections for board positions. Normally, these elections were formalities where the incumbent board members ran unopposed and won easily because nobody else wanted to do the work. But this year was different. Thomas, the homeowner who had been fined for his garbage cans, decided to run for a board position. So did Patricia and 2 other homeowners. I seriously considered running myself, but decided I did not have the time to commit to it with my work schedule. The election was held at the August board meeting, and the turnout was unprecedented. Over 70 homeowners showed up to vote, more than 3 times the usual attendance. When the votes were counted, 3 of the 5 board positions had flipped to new members, including Thomas and Patricia. Karen Whitmore retained her seat, as did Robert Chen, but they were now in the minority. The change in the board's tone and approach was immediate. At the September meeting, now chaired by Thomas as the new president, one of the first orders of business was a complete review of all covenant language. They formed a committee of homeowners to go through the CCRs line by line and propose clarifications and revisions. Section 7.3 was one of the first rules to be rewritten. The new language specified that holiday decorations could be displayed up to 30 days before a holiday and must be removed within 30 days after. It was clear, specific, and reasonable. The new board also implemented a new fine policy that required warnings before any monetary penalties, and created an appeals process for homeowners who disagreed with violations. They brought in an independent auditor to review the HOA's finances, which raised questions about some of the payments that had been made during Karen's tenure as president. In October, the HOA completed its investigation and issued its findings. They determined that the HOA had violated several regulations regarding proper governance and financial transparency. Specifically, they found that Karen Whitmore had failed to properly disclose her financial interest in the advisory fees paid to her company, which constituted a conflict of interest under Arizona law. The HOA imposed a fine on the HOA and required additional oversight and reporting for the next 2 years. They also recommended that the HOA seek restitution from Karen for the improperly authorized payments. Karen resigned from the board in November rather than face a recall effort that was gaining momentum. She moved out of the neighborhood entirely by the end of the year, selling her house and relocating to somewhere in Nevada. Robert Chen, who had been complicit in much of the problematic governance, chose not to run for re-election when his term ended in December. With the board completely restructured and new policies in place, the HOA began operating in a way that actually served the homeowners rather than punishing them. Fine revenue dropped dramatically, not because people were violating rules more, but because the new board focused on education and reasonable enforcement rather than gotcha tactics. The atmosphere in the neighborhood improved noticeably. People were friendlier, more engaged, and less fearful of arbitrary punishment for minor issues. In January, almost a full year after the original fine letter appeared on my door, I received one more piece of mail from the HOA. It was a check for $200 along with a letter from Thomas as board president. The letter explained that the independent audit had identified several fines that had been improperly assessed during the previous board's tenure. My situation had been reviewed again, and the board had determined that not only should I never have been fined in the first place, but I had been charged late fees and additional penalties that were punitive and not properly authorized under the covenants. The $200 represented a refund of fees that I had never actually paid, but that had been assessed against my account. Combined with the $500 I had received earlier in the year, this brought my total refund to $700. I had never paid a cent of the original fines, but the HOA had still managed to reimburse me $700 when you counted the attorney fees and the improper charges. It was surreal and satisfying in equal measure. Thomas called me that evening to make sure I had received the check. "I wanted to personally thank you," he said. "If you had not stood up and fought back when you did, none of this would have happened. You exposed problems that had been going on for years, and you gave the rest of us the courage to demand better. This neighborhood is a much better place because you would not just pay an unfair fine." I appreciated his words more than he probably knew. "I just did not want to be pushed around over something that made no sense," I told him, "but I am glad it led to bigger changes. Everyone here deserves an HOA that works for them, not against them." We talked for a while longer about the improvements that had been made and the plans for the coming year. The new board was focusing on actual community building rather than rule enforcement. They were planning neighborhood events, improving the common areas, and making sure homeowners felt heard and respected. After I hung up with Thomas, I sat in my living room thinking about everything that had happened over the past year. It had started with something so simple and stupid: Christmas lights in February. I had been angry, frustrated, and stressed for months. I had spent money on an attorney and hours researching laws and regulations. I had attended boring meetings and confronted people in public in ways that were outside my comfort zone, but in the end, it had been worth it. I had not only won my own battle, but had helped spark a change that benefited everyone in the neighborhood. The $700 sitting in my bank account was nice, but the real victory was knowing that the HOA was now operating the way it should have been all along. I thought about all the homeowners across America who deal with difficult HOAs and never fight back because it seems too hard or not worth the effort. I understood that impulse. It would have been easier to just pay the $100 fine back in February and move on with my life. But sometimes standing up for what is right, even in small ways, can make a difference that ripples out beyond what you initially imagine. My neighborhood was proof of that. What had been a toxic environment of arbitrary rules and punishment had transformed into a community where people actually wanted to participate and engage. The fear that had kept people isolated in their homes had been replaced with a sense of collective ownership and pride. Walking through the neighborhood now, you could see the difference. People were outside more, talking to each other, working on their yards not because they were afraid of fines, but because they cared about how the neighborhood looked. The following spring, I put up Easter decorations in early April. Just some pastel lights and a couple of those inflatable bunnies that my nephew had convinced me to buy. They stayed up for about 3 weeks after Easter because, again, I got busy and forgot about them. Nobody sent me a fine letter. Nobody posted a yellow notice on my door. A neighbor walking her dog stopped to compliment the bunnies and told me her kids loved seeing them. That was how it was supposed to work. That was what an HOA should be. A way for neighbors to work together to maintain property values and create a pleasant community, not a weapon to threaten and control people over trivial matters. I never did put up Christmas lights the following December. Not because I was afraid of another fine, but because I had learned my lesson about leaving them up too long and I did not want to deal with taking them down. Instead, I put up a nice wreath and some simple decorations that were easier to manage. They came down on January 2nd, well within the new 30-day guideline. Jennifer Blake sent me a holiday card that year, thanking me for being what she called one of the good ones among her clients. She told me that most people either gave up too easily or fought battles that were not worth fighting. I had found the right balance, she said, of standing firm on principle but knowing when to accept a reasonable resolution. I kept that card on my refrigerator for months. The HOA board continued to function well under its new leadership. Thomas served as president for 2 years before passing the role to Patricia, who brought her own strengths to the position. The neighborhood established a newsletter and a community website where homeowners could easily access documents, ask questions, and stay informed about what the board was doing. Transparency became the standard rather than the exception. Karen Whitmore never faced criminal charges for the financial irregularities, though there was some talk about it at the time. The amounts involved were relatively small, and the consensus among the homeowners was that they just wanted to move forward rather than spend more money and energy on legal battles. The address fine and the forced oversight were punishment enough, and Karen's reputation in the property management world took a serious hit that probably affected her more than any fine would have. Looking back now, several years after that first letter appeared on my door, I sometimes wonder what would have happened if I had just paid the $100 fine. The HOA would have continued its pattern of aggressive enforcement and questionable financial practices. Karen would still be running things with an iron fist, Homeowners would still be afraid to plant the wrong color flowers or leave their garbage cans out 10 minutes too long. The neighborhood would be quieter, more compliant, but also less happy and less connected. Instead, a fight over Christmas lights in February led to a complete transformation of how our HOA operated. It reminded me that institutions, even small ones like a neighborhood homeowners association, only stay accountable when people are willing to stand up and demand it. It is easy to feel powerless against bureaucracy, whether it is a government agency, a corporation, or an HOA board. But the truth is that these organizations rely on people not fighting back, on the assumption that the hassle is not worth it for most individuals. Sometimes the hassle is worth it, though. Sometimes fighting back is not just about winning your own battle, but about making things better for everyone who comes after you. The new families who moved into Sunset Ridge Estates after all this happened had no idea how different things had been just a year or two before. They joined an HOA that was fair, transparent, and reasonable. They did not have to fight for that because others had already done the fighting. I still live in the same house in Chandler, Arizona. I still work from home most days. I mow my lawn, maintain my property, and pay my HOA dues on time. The difference now is that I trust the organization managing our neighborhood. I know that if I have a question or a concern, it will be heard and addressed fairly. I know that the rules are clear and applied consistently. I know that the board is working for the homeowners, not against them. And I have a check stub and some letters in a file folder in my office that serve as a reminder of what happened when I decided not to just go along with something that was wrong. $700, a formal apology, and a completely transformed HOA. Not a bad outcome for refusing to pay a fine for Christmas lights in February. The story could have ended badly in so many ways. I could have ended up with an actual lien on my property if I had not gotten legal help. The HOA could have doubled down and made my life miserable in other ways. The other homeowners might not have supported the push for change, leaving me isolated and branded as a troublemaker. But none of those things happened because I did my homework, stayed calm and factual in my arguments, and found the right allies at the right time. I learned a lot about HOA law, more than I ever wanted to know honestly. I learned about Arizona property statutes and governance requirements. I learned how to read financial documents and spot red flags. I learned how to speak effectively at public meetings and build coalitions with neighbors. These were not skills I had expected to develop when I bought my first house, but they turned out to be valuable in ways that extended beyond this particular situation. My experience became something of a legend in certain HOA reform circles, which I discovered when Jennifer Blake asked if she could use my case as an example in a presentation she was giving to a bar association group about homeowner rights. I agreed, and she later told me that several other attorneys had reached out wanting copies of the documents and correspondence, because it was such a clear example of how to properly challenge an HOA overreach. I even got contacted by a local news reporter who wanted to do a story about HOA abuses and reform. I declined to participate because by that point things had settled down and I did not want to reignite any drama in the neighborhood. But I appreciated that the issue was getting attention because I knew my situation was far from unique. The reality is that there are thousands of homeowners associations across the United States, and while many of them function perfectly well, there are also plenty that abuse their power and make life difficult for the people they are supposed to serve. Some HOAs are run by petty tyrants who enjoy the small amount of power their position gives them. Others are simply incompetent or careless in how they interpret and enforce their own rules. And some, like mine had been, have financial conflicts of interest that create incentives for aggressive fine enforcement. Homeowners need to know their rights and not be afraid to assert them when necessary. That does not mean being combative or difficult for no reason. It means reading the documents you receive when you buy a home, understanding what rules actually exist versus what rules people assume exist, and being willing to ask questions and push back when something does not seem right. It also means getting involved in HOA governance rather than just complaining from the sidelines. If your HOA is not functioning well, run for the board or support candidates who will make positive changes. Attend meetings and ask questions. Request financial documents. Build relationships with your neighbors so you can work together when issues arise. These things take time and energy, but they are part of the responsibility of homeownership in a planned community. For my part, I have stayed involved in our HOA in a limited way. I do not want to be on the board because I value my free time too much, but I go to meetings a few times a year and I stay informed about what is happening. I vote in elections and I speak up when I have concerns. I am friendly with my neighbors and we look out for each other. This is what community should be, and I am glad we were able to create it even though it took a fight to get there. Every time I drive into my neighborhood and see the Sunset Ridge Estates sign, I think about that journey from February to January, from an unfair fine letter to a refund check and an apology. It was exhausting and stressful while it was happening, but now it is a source of pride. I stood up for myself and ended up helping an entire neighborhood in the process. The Christmas lights that started everything are still in a box in my garage. Maybe I will put them up again someday, though probably not in February. But if I do decide to leave them up past what someone considers a reasonable time, I will not be worried about getting a fine. The rules are clear now, the process is fair, and the people running the HOA actually care about doing right by the homeowners they serve. That is worth more than $700, though I will admit the money was pretty nice too.